Today, we welcome everyone to be part of this conversation and share and offer, if you can in the future, to share your work in future research and reporting show and tells. I'm just going to get started right away. Just to refer to the OpenUK Code of Respect and Competition Policy, which you can get on either of those, on those two QR codes. And then just a couple of sort of housekeeping I'm going to start with, which is the Kubernetes 10th birthday party on the 6th of June is at Red Hat Innovation Labs. And that is there on that QR code, and sign up to our OpenUK newsletter when you can. OpenUK London meetup is for cybersecurity is on Tuesday, 21st of May. And for maintainers is OpenUK Online Maintainers, Wednesday, 22nd of May. So all things that you can participate in. So as I said, I'm Dr. Jennifer Barth. I'm the Chief Research Officer at OpenUK, and I'm the founder at Symmetry. We are a small research firm, and so we do all the research as a team alongside the OpenUK fantastic team. And I'll be hosting today. We also have Dr. Dawn Foster joining us, and Chris. Hi, Dawn. And Chris Howard. And the organization of today will be that Dawn will speak for about 20 minutes, and there'll be about 10 minutes for any questions you have. And Chris will then speak for about 20 minutes and about 10 minutes of questions. And then I will tell you a little bit about where we are at OpenUK with our research and reporting, and talk about the survey that just went live last night. So I'm just going to start off with Dawn. Dawn, if you're ready, I'm going to do a brief introduction. So Dawn is the Director of Data Science at the Chaos Project. She works as the Director of, of Data Science. I'm reading Chaos Project, which is also a board member and maintainer. She's an OpenUK board member and co-chair of CNCF TAG Contributor Strategy. She has more than 20 years of experience at companies like VMware and Intel with expertise in community building strategy, open source governance, metrics, and more. And she's spoken at over 100 industry events and has a PhD, MBA, MBS in computer science. Did you know I was going to give you the whole background, Dawn?
I didn't. This is fabulous. Thank you.
So Dawn, welcome. I'm going to let you bring up your slides. I'll stop sharing mine.
I wanted to start by just very quickly thanking the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for funding the Chaos Data Science Initiative, along with the Linux Foundation and the Ford Foundation, who provide support for the Chaos Project. I don't need to tell you who I am because Jennifer did a fabulous job of introducing me, so I'm going to skip that one altogether. I'm going to talk about a few things today. I'll start with just a very brief overview of Chaos and how you can contribute. I'll talk about the importance of metrics, both from a consumption perspective and a contribution perspective. And then I'll talk a little bit about several topics, including responsiveness, contributor sustainability, and organizational participation in the context of some practitioner guides that we are developing within the Chaos Project for people to use. So Chaos stands for Community Health Analytics for Open Source Software. We are an open source Linux Foundation project. We are globally distributed. We have people all over the world. We are, I think, I'm a little biased, but a lovely place to spend some time. We are not focused on public health, so things like the NHS, vaccines, stuff like that. We're focused on open source project health. We're not for profit. We don't have any specific mandate. And we're not only focused on code contributions, which I'll talk about in a minute. There are so many ways to get involved in Chaos. While we love code contributions, we also love people who can help us define metrics or answer questions from people who are interested in Chaos. We have whole groups of people making contributions focused on community management, project management, design, badging. And we also love to have people talk about how they use Chaos metrics by writing blog posts or appearing on our podcast. There are so many ways to get engaged with Chaos. One of the easiest ways to get started is to find an area of the project that you're passionate about and start attending some meetings. In particular, a lot of people start by joining some of our working groups. Personally, I'm pretty active in the OSPO and data science working groups, along with metrics development and metrics models. If you're interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have a working group for that. But we also have badging programs where we award events and more recently projects with DEI badges. Our Chaos Africa chapter is super active, and we've recently restarted our Chaos Asia chapter with Divya Mohan organizing. And we're also starting some chapters in Latin America and the Balkans. And then we also have 2 different open source projects, Augur and Grimoire Lab, that are software projects that you can use to gather and analyze your metrics. The obligatory XKCD slide. Evaluating the viability of open source projects that are strategic for your organization is super important, because when open source projects fail, when they have security vulnerabilities, change their license, or run into other difficulties, it can disrupt your business and damage your reputation. It's particularly important to look at the viability of any open source projects that are critical for your ability to deliver products to your customers and your users. This can include products that are built on top of an open source technology, or where those open source projects are integrated into your products or your infrastructure. If you couldn't easily swap that project or technology out with a drop-in replacement of something similar, you really should be assessing the viability of that project and understanding any risks that might come with it. Hopefully, you're also contributing to the strategic open source projects that you're consuming within your products, services, and infrastructure, because that's probably the best way to mitigate the risks associated with using a project. If your employees are integrated within the community and regularly contributing, they can not only make contributions that improve the viability of the project, they're also likely to have early warning signs of any potential disruptions. It can help to think strategically about how consumption and contribution go together, and how contributing to open source projects can reduce the risks associated with consuming those projects. Now, within the Chaos project, we tend to look at metrics as being used for 2 primary purposes. Historically, Chaos has been a bit more focused on what I'm calling contribution metrics. These metrics are designed to better understand the projects that you're participating in or the projects that you run, whether those open source projects are driven out of your company or maybe third-party projects that your employees contribute to. Most OSPOs tend to think of this as outbound or upstream contribution. And we have a starter project health metrics model with a collection of 4 simple metrics to help people get started measuring contribution. Lately, we've also been focusing on consumption metrics, which is the second type. So these metrics are mostly related to inbound or downstream consumption of the open source software that you use in your products, services, and infrastructure. We have 4 viability metrics models that were recently developed by Gary White at Verizon. And we also have a starter viability metrics model with a few metrics to help people start measuring the viability of open source projects that they consume. And if you're interested in the topic of viability and viability metrics, we just recorded a podcast about that just went live yesterday on ChaosCast. Now, these collections of metrics are organized into metrics models, which can be found at the link on this slide, to help you think about how you might implement a set of metrics together to understand some aspect of open source project health. Now, we just launched a series of practitioner guides designed to be used by people who may or may not be experts in data analysis or open source, to help them understand how to interpret the incoming tsunami of data that's generated by open source projects, with the goal of finding ways to improve the health of those projects. Now, these guides are really useful for people in open source program offices, for project leads, for maintainers, community managers, researchers, and anyone who really wants to better understand project health and take action on what they learn from their metrics. We launched with an introduction guide and guides on 3 topics that I'll talk about in the next couple of slides, but we also have more guides coming soon, and we also welcome contributions if people want to contribute guides or contribute to the existing ones. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to using metrics to measure project health. So before we get started, it's important to think about how every open source project is a little bit different. And metrics should always be used and interpreted with the needs of that project taken into account. Small projects will have very different needs from large projects. Different communities will have different ways of working to produce their open source software. Projects and people who contribute to them will have different needs and different goals. So one of the best places to start isn't actually with the metrics, but by spending some time understanding the overall goals for the project. So we think of this as kind of the goal, question, metrics approach. By thinking strategically about the overall goals, you'll be able to decide what you need to measure to determine whether the project's actually achieving those goals. Open source projects generate a tsunami of data that can be super overwhelming. But by focusing on the goals, you can develop a metric strategy that helps you focus on the metrics that matter the most for a particular project. One key to doing this well is an interpretation of your open source metrics. So let's face it, the real experts are the people who are involved in the day-to-day work on a project. So you need to involve key people from the project, since they can help you interpret the metrics and any trends identified in ways that make the most sense for that particular project, whether you're doing research or whether you're working within a project yourself. The Introduction Practitioner Guide is designed to get you thinking about what you might want to measure and how to measure it, along with some general tips and cautions. And it's meant to complement the Practitioner Guide series, which I'll talk more about in the next few slides. If you're actively using an open source project, it's likely that you'll find bugs or want to contribute fixes back upstream. So for projects you're using, you'll want to make sure that maintainers and other contributors typically respond in a timely fashion. Seeing large numbers of issues and pull requests on a project is a red flag for me, because it can indicate that either they don't have enough contributors to handle the incoming contributions, or even worse, that they don't actually care about or want contributions from others, which unfortunately is actually something you see in some company-owned open source projects. In addition to thinking about this from a viability and consumption standpoint, it's important for projects to respond to pull requests in a timely manner, because a quick response can help you retain contributors who otherwise might become discouraged if they don't receive a timely response. Timely, thoughtful, and kind responses to contributors indicate that you appreciate their work. Now, while quick responses are important, it's also important to keep up with change requests, so pull requests, merge requests, and resolve them in a timely manner, even if the response is closing requests that will just not be merged. It's easy to get behind on incoming contributions. We all get behind sometimes, but not addressing these contributions promptly just creates technical debt and reduces the chances that they will ever be merged, because older change requests are likely to have so many merge conflicts, they just become too difficult to ever accept. So in both of these responsiveness metrics, it's important to focus on the trends. So if responsiveness is already improving, keep up the good work. However, if you see responsiveness declining, then it might be time to find ways to improve it, including recruiting more contributors and maintainers for your project, perhaps from your contributor data. And the Responsiveness Practitioner Guide has a whole bunch of details about ways to improve responsiveness for projects that you care about. Contributor sustainability is also an important part of assessing whether an open source project and community have enough contributors for the project to be sustained over the long term. So contributor sustainability has a large impact on project sustainability. There are a lot of projects with a single maintainer, as you saw earlier in the XKCD dependency comic. Many projects struggle to find enough people to actively participate in their projects and continue to maintain them over the long term. The reality is that there are a lot of open source projects and not enough contributors. So maintainers are in desperate need for help across various types of contributions that are needed to have a successful and sustainable open source project. If there are not enough contributors to sustain a project, this increases the risks that the project will fail, which creates a variety of often significant challenges for the users and other projects that depend on it. I recommend measuring contributor sustainability because there are a couple of things it can tell you. First of all, how big of an issue is your current contributor situation? If it's like this one, you really should focus on getting a few more people who can contribute and eventually be moved into leadership roles like maintainers. You might also find that there are people who are contributing more than you realized, which is the other reason that this is a really good metric. This can help you think about who you can encourage to contribute more, or maybe find someone you could move into a leadership role. Reaching out to someone and acknowledging their work while encouraging them to do more can help quite a bit with growing your contributor base. Sometimes people just need a bit of encouragement, and you can ask them for specific things that you know that they're good at. And there are several communities that I've gotten more involved in because someone asked for my specific help. Now, the catch here, and with many metrics, is that we don't just want to think about the people who are making commits. It's a good start, but you should also be thinking about how you can move people into leadership positions to be responsible for things that might not show up in your repository, like documentation, community management, marketing, and loads of other important roles. The practitioner guide linked on this slide has even more suggestions about how to improve contributor sustainability for open source projects. We don't always spend enough time thinking about how organizational participation impacts the sustainability of open source projects. So you should also look at organizational diversity as part of the health and risk for open source projects. If all or most of the contributions are from the employees at a single company, what happens when that company has a shift in strategy, or gets acquired, or just runs out of money and just goes out of business? Would the project be able to continue if the company pulled all of its employees out of the project? These single vendor open source projects might not seem risky, but they can quickly become unviable after a license change or when everyone stops working on that project. The biggest challenge from a data perspective with identifying trends for organizations in open source projects is that the organizational affiliation data is almost never accurate enough to use without doing some manual cleanup. This example is relatively clean compared to some others, but you can see that about 20% of the contributors aren't matched to organizations. If most of the work is being done by employees who work at a single company, the project might be riskier to use and harder to contribute to than a project with contributions that are spread out over many organizations, with no one single organization being dominant. If you work for that dominant company, you might want to focus on getting contributors for some other companies by reaching out to people you know who are using the project and might be interested in contributing. And this is described in more detail again in the practitioner guide that's linked on this slide, along with some additional thoughts on cleaning up some of that organizational affiliation data. I'll close by talking about how the ease in adopting open source can lead organizations to using software without considering its long-term viability. Not all open source projects are created equal, and some will be more viable than others over the long term. The success or failure of the open source projects you use can have real business implications. When a project that's incorporated into your products or services later becomes unviable, it can have negative implications for your users, your customers, and your reputation. One of the best ways to mitigate the risks associated with consuming open source is by contributing to the projects you use. So it can help to think of contribution and consumption together, especially for those projects that are most strategic for you. The CHAOSS Practitioner Guide series is designed to help you think about how you can improve these open source projects that you care about most, and by doing so from within as your employees contribute. With that, I will just say thank you, and we can open it up to questions.
Thanks, Dawn. If somebody has a question, can you just raise your hand and we'll call on you?
Or feel free to drop it in the chat. I'll
Yeah.
look at the chat as well.
Nikita?
Yeah. Hello. Hi, Dawn.
Hi,
I hope
Nikita.
you're well. Yeah. Hi. I have a question slash suggestion, if not.
Yeah.
Have you created an open source project with your advice? As, for example, I've recently seen a really good open source project where a person gave a talk about how to set up DevRel in an organization, and then she created a project like step 0, step 1, step 2, and so on. So have you thought of combining your advice into an open source project, or maybe you have already created one? Thank you.
I'm not sure that I understand your question, Nikita. Sorry.
So, I was thinking that maybe you can aggregate all your advice for the communications and the open source and put it into one open source project so people could, well, check it out, fork it out, and then follow.
Yeah. So I would say that most of this advice within the CHAOSS, so the CHAOSS project itself is an open source project. So we have all of our metrics, all of our guides, really all of our resources are available within the CHAOSS open source project. So you can actually fork most of our resources and use them however you'd like. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Do we have any other questions for Don?
And you said you're looking for volunteers. So, well, you said, don't sound correctly, that there's space for volunteers and contributors in CHAOSS. And what kind of contributions can people make?
Oh, yeah. So we're looking for all kinds of contributions. And I'll drop a link in the chat and just after I'm done talking to our kind of our new contributor guide to get people started. But we look for people who can help us develop metrics. We look for people who can use our metrics and provide feedback and write about them. We have whole groups of people that are working on community management for the CHAOSS projects. So we have some project managers. We have a design team that work on various design projects within CHAOSS. And so we have just about anything you can possibly imagine that you want to contribute. We have people making those sorts of contributions within the CHAOSS project because it's a pretty inclusive space. So there are loads of opportunities to contribute.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah. Looks like there's a question in the chat. What data or research do you have on user-centered design, usability, interaction design, user research, ethnographic contributions to open source projects? So the CHAOSS project is probably a little bit more focused on metrics and giving people the resources that they need to do their own research. So we're just starting to do some research projects within the CHAOSS project itself, but historically we've been more of a venue for people to learn how to use metrics to do their own research. So I would say that we really I don't have a lot of research on things like user-centered design, but we do have a lot of metrics for some of those areas. And if we're missing some metrics, we're also always happy to have people contribute them back as well.
Great. Do we have any other questions for Don? He says, thanks. I'll have a look for those metrics on your website.
Yeah, and I'll drop some more links in the chat that I think will be useful based on some of the questions we've had.
Don, I just wondered, actually, do you have sort of regional differences in your data? Do you ever look across different countries and what they're doing, or different ways different countries are managing their data better or worse at it, or yeah?
I don't think we have any data on that right now, partly because that geographic data is kind of difficult to get, right? So especially for open source projects, it's usually pretty difficult to figure out where people are. So I would say that we probably don't have much data about the differences across geographies. It wouldn't surprise me though if we have people within the CHAOSS project who are doing research on that topic, and I'm just probably am not as aware of it. it's a pretty big project with lots of people doing different things. So it's a little hard to keep up with exactly what research everyone's working on themselves.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dawn. If you have other questions, I'm sure Dawn's happy to take them in the chat as we're going along. If you think of anything else, we can always revert back later on. Thanks so much, Dawn.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm just going to bring up our next speaker. So this is Chris Howard coming to us from the head of the open source program office at EPAM Systems. He's going to talk about EPAM reporting today. Chris has over 10 years experience consulting for a broad spectrum of organizations in devising and delivering their digital transformation programs. At EPAM Systems, he is the lead open source program manager, supporting employees and clients with their consumption, contribution, and maturity in open source, whilst focusing on continuing to build a strong internal engineering company. And both Chris and Dawn have contributed to OpenUK reports in the past and are two people I have relied on a lot. So just to sort of note that, we're really glad to have you here today talking about your work and being part of our research as well.
Thanks so much for that introduction as well. It's always nice to hear about yourself. So great to see you all. And sorry, I think I'm showing the wrong way. Bear with me. I've definitely lost everything on that visibility. Whilst I share my screen properly, I will also welcome to the stage Katerina, my colleague, Katerina Nasadova, who is one of our product owners for the solution I'm going to be talking about today. So if I press the button here, Katerina, feel free.
Yeah, nice to meet you all. Yeah.
Great. I think I'm good now. Excellent. Great.
Oh, yeah, it's coming now. Great.
Good stuff. So yeah, thanks so much for inviting us to talk today. And unlike Dawn's presentation, which I'm incredibly envious of, I'm going to be talking specifically about a proprietary solution, which is based off the back of all of the work that EPAM has been doing in the open source space. So some of you might know EPAM built and maintains something called the Open Source Contribution Index, or OSCI as we call it. And that's an open source solution which measures organizational contributions to open source projects, and it ranks them on an annual basis. So you can look at things like languages, licenses, you can look at who's been doing what, who's been growing in that space, year-on-year change, and goes a little way in terms of providing a transparent and honest way of looking at employee contributions to open source. Off the back of that, internally within our organization, and EPAM is a real proponent, kind of really a champion of open source, we had a lot of questions coming around the business value of open source, which I'm sure many of you on the call get asked all the time in terms of, we know the benefits of open source. We've been talking about those for 30 years, but what's the value? And I think that's becoming more and more apparent. So as head of the OSPO, the Open Source Program Office, a lot of the questions I get from the people that don't necessarily live and breathe open source are, why are we spending money on this? Why is this important? How does it help? So we built a proof of concept in-house, and that has now matured into this exciting project, which I'm going to demonstrate to you today for about 15 minutes, called OSPulse, Open Source Pulse, for those of you that are vigilant. And we do have a nice little video on our website, so please have a look at that at the end. It's also voiced by myself with a bit of a funny accent, but we'll talk about that later. So where did OSPulse come from, really? The challenge was exactly that, as you see on the screen. So through building this open source index and then trying to shift that in-house to demonstrate what EPAMers, our peers, were doing in the open source space, we were being asked time and time again, where's the value being delivered? Who's doing what? How are we measuring kind of return on investment through, I don't know, new initiatives, recognition campaigns, onboarding, all of this stuff associated with our open source engagement. And three of the things that we kind of learned through doing a lot of research, going to various conferences, listening to individuals talk about open source metrics, and perhaps even the business individuals talk about the challenges, you can see on the screen. So the first one was really that organizations, much like EPAM was a short while ago, but hopefully hopefully not the case now, was really struggling to quantify the value of open source through things like existing platforms that we would use in our normal project management approaches. And I won't name those platforms, but there are many kind of big project management tools out there that just are ignorant really to open source contributions, this idea of stuff happening outside of that maybe typical project management platform. So that was one thing that was coming out. Secondly, was that tooling is sometimes difficult to use. And I say this with a caveat that this is no criticism about any, even chaos, for example, that we just heard about, but sometimes these tools are built by open source individuals for open source individuals. Sometimes they're built with a very much engineering lens. And actually, when we were talking to people that were asking the challenging questions, our CIOs, our CTOs, our project and delivery leaders, they weren't necessarily getting what we were talking about. So the tool we tried to build really detached itself from having to know about that ins and outs of open source, and instead gave you a bit more of a nicer, cleaner lens on that. And thirdly, and most importantly, from organizations today, where data is kind of always regarded as the be all and end all, but I'll always say that data isn't that. There's data is only data, and there's lots of conferences and talks around that. But actually, as organizations are trying to empower data to enable them to make these decisions, open source trends and insights were quite difficult to uncover, because that was happening out there in the open, across the wall, if you like, outside of the organization. So we came up with a solution. We launched it a few months ago, and this is really one of our first opportunities to talk to people like yourselves about this tool. And I'll be very clear, we're not doing a live demo. We're going to show you some screen grabs with some bullet points. Live demos never normally go to plan, and our instance has got lots of dummy data floating around. So for now, we're going to show you some screenshots. But at a glance, we built a tool that enabled organizations to identify trends and focus areas, super important, lots of visualizations. It then enabled us to create reports, so narrow those reports down to filter, to find individuals, geographies, etc. We're going to show you that. And then similarly, off the back of that, we started to see some really unique use cases that maybe 3 years ago, I was being asked to identify specific individuals with skills, talent bases, who've been contributing to a specific project, as well as then how could we use those to perhaps help with client conversations to make those informed decisions that I referenced. So I think the next 5 slides are really going to be a quick overview of this solution, and I'm going to talk through and try and build some use cases as to what these screens show you, and then Katerina and I will obviously take some questions. So the first slide, the starting point for your OSPL's journey, is this idea to populate all of your employees. So that might sound a bit crazy. Let's think about EPAM with 55,000 employees. The most important thing is getting their data source IDs. So in this case, GitHub, into this platform. So what we're doing is we're relying upon things like the GitHub API, public information, and we're relying upon our employees to share that ID with us. So at EPAM, we have a massively accepting policy around consuming and contributing to open source. We have about 7,000 engineers who share their GitHub ID with us. And by virtue of doing that, we're able to put them into this system. And then as soon as they start to make open source contributions, we've got their ID and we can start to pull through that data. We made this super easy because we appreciate that this tool isn't going to be used by the most technical audiences always. So you can populate this through various channels, and then you can integrate that hopefully with existing HR platforms. So many of our clients are using things like SAP, Workday, various platforms like that. As long as they're gathering this information through custom fields or whatever it happens to be, we would like to think that we can then populate it into this system. Once that's done, you then land upon your organizational dashboard. This is perhaps the kind of the heart of the solution. So as you can see on the screen, we're looking at some dummy data here, but we're looking at trends in contributors, which is very important. So how are our contributors growing as the year goes on? Are we seeing peaks? Are we seeing dips? Perhaps to mirror, I don't know, talent acquisition campaigns or increased engagement through pushing specific open source projects that are exciting, but similarly contributions themselves. So this tool is looking at the number of contributions, and that's related to push events. So we're not just looking at commits, we're looking at all kinds of contribution. To pull up some of the points that I mentioned in the previous talk around really important around non-code contribution, documentation, translation, accessibility. We're not just looking at the lines of code that are being written here. At the top of the screen, you're seeing there a really nice idea to show overall contributors for the entire organization. So we're looking at the life of your time using OSPLs. What does that kind of total number look like? Is it growing? What are those figures? And there's some really key figures that we always get asked, particularly around industry conversations and some key data around where does EPAM sit in the open source landscape. We're able to quickly say, okay, well, there's X hundreds of thousands. I think last time we checked, just over 500,000 commits in the public domain, which is fantastic. And this tool gave us those figures. So that's your kind of starting point. And from there, on the left-hand side, that blue bar, you're able to apply a whole range of filters. So date ranges, if you just want to look at what's been delivered in the last month, maybe you want to look at specific repositories, maybe you want to drill into some other metrics and filters. You have the ability to chop and change those customizable reports. One that's super exciting and one that immediately kind of flowed on from the work that we were doing around OSCI was this ability to get a real insight into languages and licenses. We know that many organizations have open source policies where specific licenses are not permitted. This idea of using copyleft, permissive, specific licenses that perhaps create some governance or some risk issues. This tool immediately allows us to scan every single contribution that was made into a project with one of those licenses, and it will pop up on here. So straight away, we're able to say, okay, we saw that license, let's investigate it. Many of the financial services and the regulated industries like this tool in the sense that actually it provides a governance, a bit of a, I don't want to use the word snooping, and that's not at all what I mean, but it provides a top-down view of the organization to say, okay, we've identified here that perhaps a compliance issue, and we can drill into the individual, the contribution, and clear that. Is that okay? Is it not okay? How do we find it? Similarly, from the language perspective, we can start to identify, are there new languages? There's a really exciting story for me, new languages that are being picked up and adopted. If we think about EPAM, we've got a growing community around Rust. Rust, a super exciting language, lots and lots of value around sustainability. And what we're doing in the open source program office is tracking that adoption of Rust through looking at the individual contributors who are not always, and I say this as an aside note, not always contributing to client projects. OSPOS looks at all open source contributions, so we can see what people's pet projects are, what other industry projects they're contributing to. And that's a really exciting view that this provides us around those repositories, languages, and licenses. Similarly, again, thinking back to what we just heard before around new contributors, this is super exciting. So have we just hired someone into the company who is a real star open source contributor that we had no idea about through that interview process? They hadn't mentioned it. Perhaps they'd shared their GitHub profile, but our TA team weren't necessarily looking at their open source activity. This screen shows us we've just seen X individual join the organization on this date. This is a big peak, perhaps, in contributions. We can do some filtering to see what's going on there and even drill down to that individual and look at the repositories they're contributing to. We want to see more and more new contributors flowing into an organization, and this screen provides that overview, and we can then start to look at trends in that contributor activity. The next one is my favorite one, or what was my second favorite one. My super favorite one is coming up on the next slide. This is around geographical contributions. For an organization like EPAM, spread all over the world, this is super important for us when we roll out new training courses to areas like LATAM, for example, or new countries where we've just established offices. We're able to immediately come onto here and see the impact of that investment in terms of mapping to open source contribution. And we have some real great case studies around an acquisition that was made, for example, or a new project that was ran up in a certain geography where open source wasn't being consumed. We're then able to come to here and start to look at what that looks like in a trend of open source contributions from those geographies. Similarly, from the converse, where we see contributions in countries perhaps where we haven't done anything from an open source program office perspective, we can then start to make sure they've got the right resources, the right infrastructure in place to support them with continuing that onward open source contribution. Now I come to my favorite slide, which is employee engagement and retention. This idea, this bottom graph, which I'll go to first, and then the top one, this idea of being able to track retention of what I like to call open source engaged engineers. So we know all of these engineers that are contributing to open source. We know of our business analysts, our testers, our documentation writers, etc., who are contributing to them, but are we retaining them? No one wants to be losing, particularly in this day and age where open source is embedded into organizations. No one wants to be losing engineers, individuals that are contributing. And this graph lets us see the amount of individuals we've hired that are open source engaged versus the amount of engineers, individuals that have left that are open source engaged. And we want to see that number kind of staying in the green, if you like. And if not, what do we need to be doing as an organization? What do we need to be looking at in exit interviews? Perhaps we need to be looking more at rewards and recognition initiatives, those kind of things. Similarly, that graph at the top shows the difference between all of those individuals we put into the system right at the beginning versus the number that are actually contributing. So if we take an organization like Red Hat, for example, which is embedded in open source, it's its core business, it is an open source organization, you'd expect that gap to be very, very small. Whereas if we take one of the organizations from the OSCI index, for example, that's kind of in the 200s and 300s, where open source is, it's happening, but not necessarily their day-to-day, we would expect that gap to be much bigger. And that's the exciting part for an OSPO or for a business leader, because then you can start to think about what initiatives can we start to do to drive open source contribution? How can we start to really embed open source culture into our organization and then immediately measure it through seeing that closing gap? And I'll be super transparent with you. Our gap is a gap. Of course it is. We're a massive organization, but the initiatives that we're rolling out and the things that we're doing, we are seeing that gap close. And it's really nice to be able to say that we did X, Y, Z, and then fast forward a month later, we saw a peak there, we saw a change. Can we 100% map it to that? Maybe not, but we can definitely say it had a factor. And then my final slide, because it wouldn't be a presentation in this year or last year without mentioning AI. And I caveat this is not AI. This is just some clever mathematics and some formulas and some analysis going on behind the scenes. But this idea of getting insights and kind of real detail from the tool without you having to find it yourself. So this idea that when you log in to the system, it will tell you, did you know that in the last 30 days, contributions from Switzerland, for example, have doubled? Or did you know that this project has just had a sudden decline in its contributions? Maybe you should investigate that. So these insights are presented. We got very, very simple ones around kind of number of contributions, but similarly, we've got some really nice case studies around, you've got a group of projects that you've put into a silo, if you like, and suddenly we've just seen a new contribution to a very similar project that you haven't included in there. So do you want to include that in that box as well to start to track it? Conversely, as well, for me, insights around being able to drill into a new language that you've never seen before. So you've just had a first contribution into the Go language. What does that mean? Who is that person? Or a first contribution from a specific license. Again, is that a governance and compliance piece? So this is a tool within the tool that provides those insights on a periodic basis. So I hope I've given you a kind of a whistle-stop tour, really, of OSPULSE, our new tool from EPAM. It is proprietary. Of course, we're providing it to our clients and we're supporting people and we're selling this out. It is a tool to measure metrics from a business perspective, but it is a tool that we have built from our hearts that's provided real value to us, and we felt that we wanted to be able to share that with the wider world. We'll continue to maintain OSCI, the transparent open source index. This is the step from an enterprise perspective to enable our clients, to enable those business leaders that aren't living and breathing open source to start to be a part of that conversation and really start to measure and engage metrics and the return on investment for their organizations. So at this point, hopefully I'll be able to stop talking and Katerina might be able to answer some questions. Our emails are on screen. I'm also on Twitter, Chris_Howard. So please do reach out, but we're more than happy to take some questions now.
Thanks, Chris. Does anybody have any questions?
Perfect. Oh, Nikita,
Go.
Hi, amazing stuff. It's really nice to see the companies. I've actually never seen a company caring so much about open source, with an exception of Jira Search and Google. So what led you to this idea? Was it internal demand, or was it some external companies who came to you and said they need this tool?
Yeah, I mean, Katerina can probably add some more context, but the real reason we built this was because as an OSPO, we were being asked continually, why? What are you doing? So we're spending all this money, we've got this team, we're building things, we're excited about DevRel and building our communities, but how do we quantify the value? So a lot of the time is, and this is not that EPAM isn't funding the OSPO, EPAM is one of the, like you say, Nikita, which is great to hear, a real supporter and proponent of open source. But similarly, we need to make sure that we're delivering value for a business. That's what business is. And Katerina and the team had our proof of concept and still continue to manage our proof of concept, which is about trying to answer some of those questions. Do we have individuals with certain skill sets? Was that onboarding module successful when we rolled it out? Katerina's just done some great analysis around our learning tools as well. And so I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add, Katerina, on that point.
Yeah, I think that's it. You know better the history, so, and the request.
Thanks. Christina, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I'm curious if you've been able to track on some of the metrics you mentioned around, like, you know, this language or this type of contribution is more energy efficient, right? Like when talking about different business values of open source, is there anything kind of beyond just the contribution model? I've used similar models for knowledge-centered service where you're looking for contributions to like a knowledge base. And so I have tons of questions about that, but I'm really curious about what you mentioned on efficiency metrics or just different things that can start to demonstrate the value of open source through what you're finding in this dashboard.
Yeah, definitely. So I feel terrible because Katerina's not going to answer this one either, but this is one thing I'm so excited about. So I remember I spoke at the Open Source Summit a few years ago, and I put this crazy idea out there that one day we'll be able to equate a line of open source code to X amount of carbon saving, if you like. With this tool, I genuinely believe that we will get to a point where we can say, because X company has made this many number of contributions using things like the Green Software Foundation's Software Carbon Intensity Index, or calculations around how we can equate that, or even source back to the energy source, is it renewable, et cetera, we will be able to one day say that through this number of contributions, it equated to or should equate to X amount of carbon. And you're right, we then could explore things like applying multipliers or other factors to things like Rust, which there is various papers out there that state that it is more sustainable and more efficient as a language, to say that because your company has a balance of language usage which is more around the sustainable language versus perhaps some of the older school mainframe, your carbon is therefore enhanced by 1.2, 1.3% or whatever it happens to be. So I think this tool is the first step in that direction, but there's a massive amount of work, and we're really having to leverage things like our membership of GSF, like the Linux Foundation, and some of the stuff that even the CNCF is doing around this space, to think how do we even get a data set that can then be kind of transposed into then the sustainability conversation.
Yeah, I'm trying to get my brain around, is it a level of technical data and or connectivity issue? And it seems like it's yes and
yeah.
all those things. Yeah. Cool, thank you.
Thanks.
Do we have any other questions for Chris or Katerina? Anything else? Katerina, do you want to add anything? Take your opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. So I think Chris added everything.
You're definitely presenting the next one, Katerina. It's all over to you for the next one.
Great, thank you so much. Two really interesting talks about similar things from slightly different perspectives, but the importance of data and what we can find out. And then sort of, I think the next step is the importance of the people, right? So how the data opens up that, you know, brings to life what's actually happening and how we need to support people to be able to better contribute or stay. Like Chris showed that one with the red and the green, and Dawn, you talked about the same thing, that as people leave or things change or a project ends, what do you do? Well, it's about sustaining people in that process to sustain a project. Really great. Thank you so much for contributing. Any other questions for Dawn or Chris? So I'm going to just present. Oh, great. Stephen?
Yeah, sorry. I was holding back on asking questions because it's a bit late where I am, and I thought I might be a bit too tired. But kind of to both the sets of speakers, or Chris, Katerina, and Dawn. So I work with CCAN, an open source project which does open data that's been around since kind of 2006, 2009. And it's enjoyed really good deployments around the world with high sort of prestige environments, things like that. So one of the things I'm looking at or trying to understand around the ecosystem are things like path-dependent bias or path-dependent sort of tendencies. So how to explain it? So if you think about something like product market fit, you usually start at the left-hand side and you go towards working towards the fitness. Whereas open source seems to start at the right-hand side, where a bunch of people just collaboratively think, well, this would be a fit approach. This is a fit thing to work on. We all kind of see what would be better. And then there might emerge some sort of product without even recognizing there's a market. And so people just start using the emergent paradigmic thing. And then some point later, the market does sort of exist. It's a path dependence. It's a reinforcement of the usage of that happening, or that code base. So in that context, something like an open source project for open data, which emerged in like a very active open community around open knowledge, civic hacking, civic tech, open government. There's a lot of feedback loops. So the question is, how do you measure value? Well, I think it's kind of, to what extent does this thing help any entities, individuals, or organizations exploit via the tool, or shortcut exploration to find solutions to their challenges? And what I'm kind of trying to work out is, how can you look at a software project and say, we understand how it's used, we understand how it has come to be, we understand what kind of impact it's had with different stakeholders. Now, how do we understand the potential value that it has? Not the kind of almost transactional value, but the unknown network value, based on how it's been embedded in an ecosystem, typically an economic market-based type ecosystem. I don't know if there's a great question there, but that's the thing that's bubbling around in my head. And I told you I was tired at the start.
Chris or Dawn, do you have anything to respond?
I mean, I think those are all difficult questions, right? And anytime you're looking at measuring the value of something, it gets complex, right? And especially if you're talking about measuring the potential value of it, which is, predictive at best. But what we generally encourage people to do, and this may or may not answer your question, but is really to back up and what's important to your project. Like, what do you really want to achieve? Like, what are the most important things that you want to achieve as a project? And how do you find the metrics that measure whether or not you're going to be successful? So maybe that is measuring, like the predictive value to certain types of people. And in a lot of cases, some of this data, and you'll see this if you look at the chaos metrics, not all of the metrics are just, pull data from GitHub and analyze things, right? We have certain metrics that are based on things like survey data and, perception studies and looking at how people, especially if you're looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion, things like that, like how do people feel about the way that they're treated within a community? So I think there are lots of different ways to get at that. I think in order for it not to be completely overwhelming, you have to decide what you really, really want to achieve and pick a couple of things to get started and start measuring those and see where it takes you.
Cool. Thanks.
Great, thanks. One more question, and then I'll present a little bit on OpenUK. Nikita?
Yeah, me again. It's to Katerina and Christopher. Do you have some kind of a pitch deck for the product you created for the companies as a part of Finos and other communities? I would really love to, because as you know, we all go and talk, and it would be really nice to have something I can share with the businesses and tell them, look, this is a cool thing. Because for Charles, I know where to send them, but for the project, it would be nice to get a deck or something.
Of course we do. We have all the shiny slides, websites, etc. So I'll ping you a message, Nikita, with that. Absolutely.
Great, thanks everyone. I'm just going to quickly tell you a little bit about where we're at with our work at OpenUK right now. Just a couple of minutes. I'm supposed to start here. So this is our research update. That's last year's Economics of Open Source Software report cover, to say that that's the report we're working on right now. So as many of you will know, we do a series of research reports throughout the year in the range of topics such as the economics of open source software, AI, security, skills, We've looked to do governance. And so whenever we put out our survey, we try to cover as many bases as we can. And then we try to continuously flow out the biggest issues, the ideas we want to talk about throughout the year. Last year, I think we had 4 reports go out. This year, we've already put 1 AI report out, a small one. And this is our big sort of flagship Economics of Open Source Software report. The survey has gone live, and at the end, I'm going to give you a QR code that you should please use. Please fill out the survey and also share with all your friends, neighbors, colleagues, everyone you can think of. The questions, and there are a good number, but it's a fast survey to fill out, are across adoption, personal experience. We have a little section on maintainers this year. So if you are a maintainer, you know maintainers, we'd love the feedback. Organizations and open source software, so what organizations are doing, what it means inside, what the costs are, etc. Governance, AI, security, skills, and apparently governance twice in my notes there. And then just to show, we're not exactly sure how they'll roll out this year. Definitely our Economics of Open Source software report will be out the 3rd of July, which I'll come back to. And then we are looking to do maintainer report, security, skills, and of course AI. Just to note, and I saw what Bernard said in the chats, that qualitative data is just as important, and you're a man after my own heart. So case studies, thought leadership, and just to say Will Hutton, the economist, and the DeepMind professor Neil Lawrence, among others, are writing for the report, but also will be at the launch on the 3rd of July at Digital Catapult. So I hope those in the UK or those who are coming to the UK can join. We're going to focus on finance and health this year, and we really want to look at the so what. And I think that this conversation really helped or starts that off. So, and even Stephen, what you talked about at the end there, what does it matter? Value is the economic value, the monetary value. Sure, it's also the value to people, and I think, you know, that qualitative story, that bringing to life how these things matter to people, where they are, what can we learn, why might you want to do this, why does this matter, is exactly what we're trying to get at this year. We always put in that qualitative piece because of how important it is to bring that to life. So it's always a interplay between the data that we find, and we draw that from all sources that are willing to share and to help us have that conversation. We have the survey data, and then we have people speaking and representing what they're doing, projects they're doing, so that we get that full story of value and values across the open source ecosystem. Just to note, with the economic analysis, that we've been doing this over the last few years, and it's an attempt to find new, innovative, creative ways to think about the value of the open source software economy in the UK. It's specifically looking to the UK because we haven't had those numbers here before, although we haven't really had those numbers anywhere until the most recent Harvard report that's come out. That's global. So we want to be part, and we continue to be part of that conversation, and to try to push the boundaries and think of all these different ways that we might be able to consider economic value, both so that the government hears, so that organizations hear, so that people can start to you know, be paid for the work they're doing, be brought into larger projects, be recognized in all these ways. So that's why we do that, and because we know that it matters, that when you can get numbers, then you can start talking, and then you can show all the voices behind them. So as I said, our survey has gone live. It's the State of Open, the UK in 2024 survey. Now, we ask a lot of different questions in the survey because, of course, we're a small organization, and we want to put out, it takes a lot to try to get the networks of people to respond. And so we do that once a year across everything we can think of. So really hoping that you can, as I said, share this QR code, share the survey, and please respond. It's open until the 11th of June. The report launches on the 3rd of July. There's a QR code to sign up, and following it will be the State of Open summer drinks, and everyone is invited to attend here in London. just to note that the survey is for UK, those who live who are in the UK do the survey, because that's the data that we need. So just to note that if you can go on and be part of it, that's a key factor. Our next research and reporting show and tell will be Friday, July 12th, 4 o'clock BST. Please join, please tell people about it. And that's it for us. Does anyone have anything they want to add, or any questions, any thoughts before we maybe end a little bit early? Checking the chat. Okay, great. Thank you so much for supporting our conversation and being part of the narrative. If you want to be part of this process, please reach out to the OpenUK email. And as I said, please do take our survey. I'll say that over and over. And yes, join us again on the 12th of July. Thank you so much, everyone. And we'll see you next time.